Hey everybody, we're gonna be debunking communism today. Yeah, let's get into it. I'm gonna have a whole slideshow presentation for this. Let's get into it. I just want to debunk communism due to the rise of the DSA. People don't know how bad communism actually is. So let's get into it. Let's get into it. All right. Whenever it decides to load. There we go. So let's start with what Marxism actually claims. That's the most important thing. What does Marxism actually claim? What does communism actually claim? So it's not the same as, well, the Nordic countries are communist. That is not true. Nordic countries are not communists. They are not even socialists. They're just capitalists with high regulatory systems and high stuff like that. So what communism actually is a classless, stateless, moneyless society, common ownership of the productive assets, production organized for need, and traditional political struggle. So pretty much classless, stateless, moneyless society, that's what communism is. Socialism is just a gateway to that thing. And so saying, well, the Nordic countries are trying to be communist is not true. They're just capitalist in a certain sector. So yeah, that's what the goal is for communism, and this is pretty bad already. Looking at it, classless cannot work. A classless society cannot work. It's against human nature, and when you kind of go against human nature in some ways, it won't work. But let's get into my next slide. So let's just show the promise of communism. Communism identifies failures in capitalism, right? So like for example, workers can be exploited, wealth can dominate politics, like we see that right now in America. Markets can neglect community, and economic power needs moral limits. I agree with that, but you can still be capitalist and believe in that stuff. Um, like for example, you can still have capitalism and go against all this stuff. Like again, I believe billionaires have too much power in politics. I agree with that. I believe that the market can neglect community. I believe that economic power needs regulation because totally free market. It needs regulations because then workers could be exploited, like we saw that in the Gilded Age. So I actually agree with this, but you can still be capitalism. But this is why communism sees moral because they don't understand capitalism. If you dive deep into capitalism or just use logic, you'll understand that this is not the best cue for communism because you can still be capitalism and believe in all this stuff. So here's the thing, right? The calculation problem. This is my first argument is communism. Without exchange among independent owners, planners lose essential signals. So what is the calculation problem? What should be the four questions I would give is what should be produced, what methods waste fewer resources, where should scarce capital go, and what corrects bad planning. You lose a lot of this when you don't have a profit and loss system and you take away the market. So businesses, we have an overproduction problem in the United States. In every single communist society, there's always shortages. You don't see that in the United States. There's never shortages. Why? Because there's many different companies, first of all. So if one company goes out of business, well, there's still other companies. Second of all, and this is actually pretty important here, the second thing is profit and loss know how much to buy. When you take away that, you're kind of just guessing because you have to just predict how much a group of people want to buy. So it's hard. It's not easy. And I think there's a Soviet economist who said it's almost impossible to do that. And I agree with him. It is almost impossible to do that because how can you know, for example, milk, or let's use milk, for example. Milk can also just be drink, raw, fine. Not raw milk, but I'm just talking normal milk. Then you also can use milk for cheese, ice cream, a lot of stuff like that. So how do you know how much needs to go to this, how much needs to go to that? Same with steel, a lot of rare earth minerals, a lot of almost everything, wood, lead, a lot of stuff can be used for many different things, and you need to know exactly how much that needs to go without a profit and loss system, because if you're running on a profit and loss system, that goes against communism. So this is the first problem. The calculation problem will automatically lead to shortages. So yeah, this is pretty much the knowledge issue. So like local conditions also another plays a part. Like for example, there might be a bad harvest. There might be a what's it called? I'm trying to think of stuff like that, like a famine, stuff like that, a virus. Like all those might lead to unexpected shortages, and that will completely kill the economy. So this is like the knowledge problem. That will kill the economy. That will kill people who live there, right? I mean, we saw this with the Holodomor. We saw this with Ukraine. There was always bad harvests. But Holodomor was not a bad harvest. Actually, everyone that was victims of it said it was a good harvest, and then it committed genocide. But the Holodomor shows that, like, they say it's a bad harvest, and shows that can happen, right? There might be a lot of bad harvests, and and then the knowledge problem, without a profit and loss system, without private markets, because when you have private markets, what's it called? When you have private business, they have their own capital at risk. The government does not, right? The government does not have their own problem at risk. Because, for example, private business took a loan, probably in debt. They have workers they have to pay for. You have other things you have to pay for. They will do everything possible to make sure that this is fixed. But with the government and local communities, they can't do that. They're weakened. So you'll need some type of private market to know this. And also, again, one big central authority in the United States, for example, wouldn't work. You need multiple, and that's also still problematic. So now the other thing, the incentive structure. This is actually my go-to argument against communism. So we look at, like, why do people do certain things, right? Why do people create businesses? Well, people create businesses because the incentive is to take a risk, and if it succeeds, you'll become really rich. Or not even really rich. You'll have a good, stable life. And some people don't want to do that. But also, it's just natural and it's biological. People respond to incentives. And so capitalism works within that. Right? Communism takes that way. Right? Takes that way. So pretty much it targets over consumers, hidden. You can see the slide. But when everyone is kind of like equal, right? Or stuff like that, it kind of leads to incentive structure. That's a problem. People won't work these harder jobs. These essential jobs, mining, that's an essential job for society. Oil rig, construction, right? A lot of these things that would employ people, the skyscraper window washers. Who wants to be a skyscraper window washer? Okay, nobody. But one, those people are employed now and they're getting good money, right? The reason why people work these hard jobs is because the paycheck is there. And unless you're an illegal immigrant, they're just doing it for work. But most American citizens, they see that the paycheck is there, they're going to go work it. So you're taking that away with communism, right? Everyone's equal. And also, again, everything here shows the incentive structure. It's hard to have a good communist society because the incentive problem is huge. Economic control creates political leverage. So here's the thing. Here's another thing with communism. And I was watching a Jordan Peterson when Jordan Peterson was like based back then. You can tell that he was, what's it called? He was, obviously he was good back then, but he gives this good problem with the transition phase. I need to drink water. When we look at the transition phase, right? So pretty much there's the transition phase, the dictatorship of the proletariat. What is the dictatorship of the proletariat? The dictatorship of the proletariat, oh my gosh, it's like a transitional phase where the workers overtake the bourgeoisie, which is the rich people. And so now the workers are in control of the means of production. Now here's the problem, right? Here's a big problem with this. Usually, a group of people will look for a leader, or for a group of people to lead to stuff. You're gonna need a leader, right? You can't just have like a pure democracy in this. People are gonna need a leader, right? And that's just natural. There's usually always leaders in every group, right? If you look at friend groups, if you look at just groups of people, right? There's always a leader, right? Because you need a leader for that stuff. So now that equals there's a dominant person there. Now, the problem with that is, well, if there's a dominant person there, he gets more power. And eventually, he can become a dictator, he become this and that, and there's just a group of people that are always more popular, more outgoing, better, and that would not lead to a classless society or a stateless society, because these people will probably make a state. So it's hard to say, well, there's going to be no leaders. If there is leaders, that guy's going to be using for political leverage. I mean, obviously. It just, that is how humans think. And so what communism has to do is ignore that, which is impossible. They don't want to ignore that. Humans don't want to ignore that. Humans are naturally want power. And so trying to ignore that is almost impossible. So it makes no sense that people are going to, be equal and stuff like that and be okay with it. Soviet collectivization turned era to catastrophe. So, we can go to the Holodomor. The Holodomor is the greatest example here, right? So, pretty much, let's explain the Holodomor. A really interesting topic. I recommend you guys all read into it. I recommend you guys all watch videos on it. Do your research on this. It's really good. But what happened in the Holodomor is that there was a lot of peasant farmers, right? And so they're called kulaks. Those are the rich farmers, right? They pretty much deported or imprisoned the rich farmers, and all that was left were the poor farmers and the middle class farmers, right? And they all merged into one. So the Soviet Union would come, right, and just take everything, pretty much. Would literally take everything that was harvested, they would take. And that was rough. They would force collectivize. And so that led to people dying on the street. That led to people just malnourished. And people tried to immigrate. They would not emigrate, so trying to leave the country. Well, they couldn't because the Soviet Union would not let them. And so people just died. A lot of people committed suicide. A lot of people just died because, the harvest was good, actually. But they were forcefully collectivized and killed many people because many people didn't have enough to eat. And so, yeah, that was one thing. And taking away those, big farmers was also a bad thing because they produced a lot of the food for their society. Two, production informed, there's a lot of shortages in the USSR. I mean, black markets were huge in the USSR. But if you even look at every communist society, right, or socialist society, you want to be like, socialist, right? If you look at any communist society, they all had black markets, and they were all really big because the black markets, one, were more expensive than the free market, but two, it was just like another free market. And so people had money, right, and they went there instead of going to the communist or the USSR ran grocery stores. And now number 4 is really important. They would pretty much, anyone that was Christian, anyone that was against the government, they would kill, or they would put into the gulags. And so that's just not good. This is just examples of communist societies. They say, well, this wasn't used correctly. I don't care. If you see this amongst every single communist society, it just can't work. Now the Great Leap Forward, another one, not good. Killed 30 million, I think it was. The estimates are 30 to 45 million. That's that's a lot. That's a lot. And so, people, so they forcefully collectivized, right? Right? And also a bad central planner led to 45 million people dying, right? And also, same thing with the Holodomor. I forgot to add this in. With number 2, you look at unrealistic production targets. They will set astronomically high targets, and if you didn't reach that target, they'll just take all your food, right? And they'll take all the harvest, and they'll let you keep the surplus. That's also what happens in every communist society. Always. They always expect a lot, but when the incentive structure is not there, people don't do it. That's why there's always problems with communist societies. I gotta do more research in the Great Leap Forward, but I know this was a catastrophe. It was a catastrophe, and it also led to It led to China being a mixed economy. Cambodia shows the endpoint of total social reconstruction. So another thing was Pol Pot was a communist leader. He overthrew Cambodia, and he completely took away free markets. He completely, put groups of people into like concentration camps, pretty much. It wasn't like, Yahtzee concentration camps. I'm sorry to say Yahtzee because, YouTube guidelines. But it wasn't like that. It was, putting people in this area where they could not leave. And they would force labor, high targets, and they were unexpected just for too high. And again, it completely killed markets. And then also, more brutal than Mao, putting anybody in jail that disagreed with him. Again, another real world example of what happened here. Putting political enemies in prison. Do you see that in the United States? No. Right? No, it depends. Democrats did do that in 2021 under Biden, but not at the same level as this, right? Not the same level as this. And capitalism has a much higher track record with this than communism ever did, and you see it. Next, the Berlin Wall answered the final question. In the 1960s, the Berlin Wall was made, and then East Berlin and West Berlin were separated, and that led to divided nations. And you just look at the difference between the two. One, people were escaping. You had to build a wall to keep your people in. Like, that just shows how bad it was. A communist society had to put a wall to keep their people in because everyone was just flying to the other side because it was so much better. It was so much better. So, it was so much better. And if you just look at the two societies, the West was so much more prosperous. The people were happier. It makes no sense, right? I can't believe people are still communists when you look at these two differences. And so, here's one thing. They always say this was not real communism. And sure, it was not real communism. That is partly true. You look at theory, yes. I agree with you. I'm not one of those capitalists that say, well, you're wrong. But I agree. The status ideal was not reached. The moneyless society was not reached. But classless society, this is the hard part. The classless society is never going to be achieved because when you have, again, groups of people that are going to become leaders, you need leaders to lead people. You just need leaders. You can't just have a group of people without a leader. So, even transitions need rulers, okay? You need rulers. You can't, again, as I said, it's almost impossible. It's always natural someone's going to become a leader, and try to say, well, it's going to be perfect, it's not going to happen. And so it will lead to this, right? The likelihood of communism ever being purely achieved is slim to none. And just because the classless society will never be reached and the stateless society will never be reached. Now, sanctions. Their second thing is the sanctions. So I agree. Sanctions in war can reduce output. And a lot of things do matter. But we can look at capitalist societies that have performed better under sanctions. Cuba is still allowed to trade with a lot of the world, just not the Western world. Iran, not really a communist society. But a lot of countries were allowed to trade with the rest of the world. And you see them producing still bad. Same with Venezuela. Venezuela's output of oil decreased significantly before the sanctions. Before the sanctions ever hit. In 2000, I think, when the communist leader took leadership in Venezuela, they were still collapsing. They were not doing good at all. By no metric, they were doing good. So, the restrictions are still bad, even without the sanctions. Same with North Korea. Like, they were still falling before sanctions. Like, Donald Trump put sanctions in 2017 because he wanted these communist nations to fall so they could have a capitalist regime so they could do better instead of going in and actually taking them out. Yeah, so here's another thing, right? They say, well, Christianity should be, is socialist. So that's not true, right? What Christianity does teach is like, human dignity before class, right? Like, they do believe that. I do believe that. Like, we should respect human life, but it's not against class, and it's not nowhere in Catholic teaching, right? I'm a Catholic. I'm using Catholic teaching here. Nowhere in Catholic teaching does it say that you can't have a class society. Again, it actually endorses private property, like businesses, endorses that Actually, I think it endorses distributionism, which is capitalism just with small businesses. So you're already despunct there. Another thing is work organization, right? Like it wants just wages. It's, if anything, it incentivizes and endorses a Nordic type capitalism. So that's what it is. But yeah, I agree with that. I agree with tariffs. I agree with a lot of stuff like that. I don't want a big welfare state, but that's what Catholicism is preaching. Not, is against collectivism and taking away private property. Now, this is what I'm going to tell you. This is why I want you to look into economic nationalism. This is where private property and prices, right? So, pretty much economic nationalism is tariffs on foreign goods. So, workers are exploited, right? I agree with you. In other countries, with free trade, they can go to countries like any country in Africa would use slave labor and then produce their stuff there. With tariffs, that makes it harder for them. Another thing, regulation, taxing billionaires. I agree with that. Middle class tax cut. Biggest group of people in the world. Around the world. Biggest group of people in the United States. Middle class tax cut. Funded by taxing billionaires. Yes, I agree with you. I agree with you. I am an economic nationalist. I'm a right-wing economic nationalist. And I agree with you. I am on wholehearted agree. I think we should help our middle class. Right? We should help the middle class. But another thing I have to say is the reason why there's the big wealth gap, easy to debunk, is not because of capital. It's because of capitalism, but it's not inherently a bad thing. So, let's just show how the communist societies have failed. Can people exit our countries? Yes, people can leave our countries. In a lot of socialist nations, you can. North Korea, West Berlin, USSR, they did it so many times. Like Cambodia, Venezuela, you couldn't leave your country. Second of all, the prices exposed to air. There's a lot of shortages because, when you're not running on prices, you don't know how much to buy for a certain thing. Second of all, can opposition organize? Yes. In capitalist societies, yes. But in communist societies, it's a stateless society, so there's no, you have to agree with it because there's no state. It's pretty much anarchist. And can rulers be removed peacefully? Yes. In capitalist societies, yes. In communist societies, we see an authoritarian dictatorship. So a noble promise cannot excuse a broken mechanism. It just cannot work. It's not possible for communism to work. And real communism cannot be achieved in the real world because if the United States tried to become communist and we had no state, which means we have no military, guess what? Every other country is going to invade us and take our land. So it's impossible. You need the entire world to do it. And yeah, so I'm just saying communism sucks. Economic nationalism is goated. So thank you for watching. And God bless.